Hi, my name is Steven and welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be talking to you about life is about trade-offs, how to maximize your decisions. Everything that we do in life are comprised of our decisions, and we can select alternate paths to them. Things that you could have chosen to do but didn't. Most of the time the decisions are inconsequential and don't really matter to your day-to-day routine. But sometimes you can run into decisions that can alter the course of your life. And these decisions might not be easy or straightforward to go through. They might have a lot of trade-offs. Recently, I've made a series of decisions that changed my life dramatically. And although at the present I think they're beneficial for my life, but ultimately I don't know what the final outcomes will be. But the process in which I evaluated my decisions and trade-offs might be beneficial to others, who might be going through the same trials and tribulations as myself. So how do I think through difficult decisions without regret? Let's find out. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about my background, my tips on thinking through trade-offs, and my general thoughts. Before we start, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, share with your friends, hit that notification bell if you like this content. And let's go. When we're talking about trade-offs, we're talking about making a life decision which results in pros and cons of that choice. And usually it's not a straightforward decision, and you have to weigh the pros and cons of each choice before you make a final selection. For example, you got into two universities. One is in the city and one is rural. Which one do you choose? Both have positives and negatives, and there's not a clear answer between which university you want to pick. With all things being equal, it might come down to your own personal preference in this decision. Oftentimes, these decisions can be quite difficult because you don't have all the information at the beginning. It's only when you start to dig into the details and figure out what you want does the answer become more clear. But before then, decisions can be overwhelming, and if you don't have a plan in place, it might be harder for you to think through. For me, I've optimized my process of thinking through trade-offs in the recent decisions I've made. And I believe this process will benefit others thinking through their own life decisions and trade-offs. But at its core, it really comes down to you really have to know what you want in life. Knowing this might not give you the perfect answer in each and every decision, but it will definitely be a guiding star. So here are my tips on thinking through trade-offs. Number 1, form the question. When you first start this process, outline your question so that you know exactly what your decision is. Frame the question correctly, or even just think through whether or not this is a trade-off in the first place. Oftentimes, you may think that the question is really a black and white choice, but it can actually be two sides of the same coin. From the outside, it may look like a decision, but if you think through it, it may just have no trade-offs whatsoever. For example, it may just be a straightforward answer, but you give yourself another option in order for you to contrast against something. Oftentimes, we give ourselves more choices than what we need, but in the end, we're actually just going to do one thing. The other choices aren't valid. When you're looking at trade-offs, you're looking at two or more relatively equal choices that you can make. And you have to figure out what is the best decision among them. Trade-offs are not about decisions in which you have a good decision and you have a bad decision. For example, your car is broken and you require a lot of money to fix it, or just buy a brand new car which is less than the cost of fixing your old one. In this case, it's a false choice because you really don't need to spend more money just for an older car. So asking yourself if it's a trade-off or it's a simple decision can save you a lot of time thinking through things later. Most of the time, the decisions are easy and straightforward if you frame the question properly. And you don't need to go down the path of agonizing over a choice that you need to make with trade-offs. So whenever you start to think about a decision that might become a trade-off, think about whether or not you're framing the problem correctly. Look to see if you actually need to make a trade-off or if there's a simple solution behind it. Number 2, do you feel it? Once you have a question in mind, the easiest ways to pick a decision is to feel it in your gut. Does this make sense to you or does it not? Ask yourself, how do you feel about both choices? Does one immediately stick out to you? You can save a lot of time, effort, and thinking through trade-offs if you go with your gut sometimes. Because you're checking in with yourself and making the best possible decision from what you already know. This is because we always have our preferences, even before the question is even presented to ourselves. For example, if you're an introvert, you will naturally tend to do introverted things. You won't unexpectedly be an extrovert. Choosing the option that isn't us might dramatically backfire in the end. I remember having the choice to go to school in Pennsylvania or my hometown of LA. At the time, it was a difficult decision because both schools had their merit and I was interested in both of them. It represented in my life the first real trade-off that would vastly affect the course of my life. I had a strong feeling that despite how good the academics were, I just wasn't gonna fit in and it would be very hard for me to adjust to that kind of lifestyle. So in the end, I decided to go with my gut and stay in LA for my school. To this day, I've never regretted that decision in my life. Many times in my life, I had to rely on my gut when my logical brain just couldn't make a decision. Choosing a school had long-term ramifications for my life, and I needed to go with my gut to feel what was right for me. Because even though it might make sense in the short term, over the long term, I might not get adjusted to life there. And sometimes when I'm going through trade-offs, I just can't make a logical decision yet. I need to go with what I'm feeling in the moment. Because you just can't predict the future if you're making just a logical choice. You have to feel it as well. So if you have a solid trade-off in place, feel through it. What stands out to you immediately and go with it. Number 3, process time. Now we're getting into the meat and bones of making a trade-off. If you still can't make a decision after you go with your gut feeling, then it's time for you to process it. This is definitely the hardest part when you're going through trade-offs of life decisions. You have to give yourself as much time as you need to think through all the pros and cons of that particular decision. This is important because if you have choices that you don't clearly have the answers to, you need to take time and think through them. And that time can be just what you need to clear up your mind and make a solid decision. This is because our brains need time to take in all the information available to us and then process it and then come to a final answer. Our minds needs to make sense of all that information, and then we need to be okay with the final answer, and that might take a lot of time. I've noticed that if I form the right question and just let my mind do its thing, after about a week or so, I come to a final answer. And I come to that answer naturally over that length of time, and I don't really have to push myself or think through it every single day. I actually enjoyed this process because I don't have to intensely focus on it. I can let it run in the background of my mind. So you can go through this processing time in many different ways, actively or passively. Actively would be to journal or make pros and cons lists, while passively means that you ask yourself the question and then come back to it later down the line. So when you have a big decision to make, give yourself plenty of time to think through it, process it, and come to the right conclusion. It's amazing the power of your mind when you give it a question and then some days later it'll give you an answer. Number 4, poll people. With some of the more difficult choices in your life that you don't have a clear answer to, you might want to ask the people that you trust in your life. And for those people to help you make a decision that is in the best interest of you. Because it can be very hard to gain perspective of a problem when you're knee deep in all the details of it. And others can help you think through different possibilities that you haven't thought of already. But definitely be sure to ask people of those you trust the most. Because sometimes people can steer you in the wrong direction because it's in their own self-interest to do so. And you definitely have to think through the possibility of that if you're affecting their lives through your decision. For a simple example, this can be the decision whether or not to move to a new city or stay at your hometown. The person that you ask might be a best friend and would benefit from you staying at your hometown rather than you moving away. The person that you ask might prevent you from moving because it's in their negative self-interest to see you go. So I usually poll people with trade-offs in my life once I've actually come to a decision. This way I thought through all of my rationale and I'm just getting other people's opinions and things that I haven't thought of. Because in the end, I don't want to miss a key vital part that my friends or family could provide to me. For the recent job change, I actually spent a few weeks figuring out what the trade-offs were, coming to a decision before I polled people in my life. And I asked them what should I do and I explained the rationale behind my choice. It was also really good talking to people because it gained confidence in my decision at the end of it. So I recommend if you have a hard decision or trade-off that you need to make, poll the people that you trust in your life. But only once you have a direction that you have in mind before asking those people. Because in the end, you don't want their opinions to dominate the rationale for picking that choice. You still want it to be your decision. And number 5, move forward. Lastly, when you make that final decision on your trade-off, move forward once you make that decision. Don't look back, or at least try not to. Once you pick a path, if you start to second guess yourself, you won't make any progress towards that path. Your energy will be split and you won't give the full attention to the path you've chosen. This is why it's so important to spend as much time as you can processing through your trade-offs before you pick that final decision. Because it saves time in the end by not second guessing yourselves or not regretting the choice you've made. In my previous video on no regrets, I go into more detail on how to make choices without regretting it later down the line, and how ultimately to live with the choices that you've made. It has some great examples of the choices that I've made in my life and how I minimized regret from those choices. So I recommend that once you made a decision on your trade-offs, to commit to it fully or as much as you can, and not think about the coulda, woulda, shouldas of the other decisions. It will reduce the stress and anxiety and give your full attention to the path that you've chosen, and ultimately help you to move on from where you were. So here are my general thoughts on maximizing trade-offs in life decisions. It's never easy to think through life-changing decisions that are not straightforward for you to analyze. But keep in mind that even in the worst cases, we can ultimately undo the decision that we made. It might be difficult and take time, but we can always go back to the way things were if we really wanted them to. Very few things in life are directionally one way. And for those decisions that are one way, take as much time as you need to process and think through it. Don't make a hasty decision. And ultimately, our life is what we make of it. There is no correct path in our life. So the perfectionists among us should not despair. If we make a mistake, we can course correct it. We can think through all the trade-offs and process it as much as we can, but in the end, life is unpredictable. We are all at the whims of this world and anything can change at any time. So my suggestion is to make that trade-off, think through it, and then enjoy the ride after you made that decision. So those were my tips on how to maximize your life decisions. We all at one point in our lives come to a crossroads in which we need to make a life decision that will affect the course of our future. And these decisions require careful considerations and going into detail about those trade-offs. If we make a rash or ill-informed choice, then we might have negative consequences down the line. But with some proactive steps and a process, you can make the best out of relatively equal choices. So the main keys are to go with your gut, take time to process, and when you make a decision, move forward with it. Don't look back. With that in mind, it should help make the process of a hard decision that much easier for you. So thank you for watching. Please leave a comment down below on what was a difficult life decision that you had to make and what were the trade-offs for it. And I'll see you next time.